Hello, folks. Ever so often, I like to organize and compile my stories into longer segments, as requested by many of you. I've done this before with my missing person cases, strange wilderness experiences, and even my isolated trucker stories. But this time, I'm going to do one that only features my winter wilderness specials that I've put together over the last few years or so. This way, you can enjoy these odd and eerie experiences uninterrupted while at work, play, or just winding down for the night. This compilation covers all winter specials from 2020 onward, up until my most recent special that I uploaded earlier this month. So bring the dogs inside, bolt your doors, lock your windows, grab a strong drink, and throw another log on that fire. 'Cause tonight, it's storytelling time. As the cold winter weather moves in, I thought I'd share a few more strange and downright spooky wilderness stories that my listeners have sent to me. So here you go. Story 1. Hello, my name is Ken Tucker, and back in the 80s and 90s, I was a full-time logger that operated primarily in the Trinity County region. One summer, I was doing some work near the top of Buck Mountain at around 5,000 feet in elevation. I was dragging some dug-for logs down an embankment that I had fallen the previous workday, when all of a sudden, a thick blanket of fog began rolling down the hill like a river and eventually settled on top of me. I found myself completely lost in the middle of the thickest sea of fog I've ever experienced. By the way, I should mention that it was crystal clear right before this happened. But now, I could no longer see more than a couple feet in any direction. And in this fog came an eerie silence. I stood there, just watching and waiting for it to dissipate, but it hadn't. Not long after, something began running around me. It worked its way around the edges of the woodline and gradually became closer. That's when I began to get a true sense of what might be happening, and that I was being stalked by something that had the skill to maneuver around under the cover of thick fog. I had a general idea of where I was in proximity to my truck, and so I began carefully feeling my way toward it. I ran into a few trees on my way, but made it to the safety of my cab. I had no choice but to remain seated in there, as visibility was too poor to drive anywhere, let alone see the road. But as I sat there, I remembered hearing the hurried rush of footsteps all around me in the truck, the snapping of twigs, and the shuffling of rock. It was loud enough to notice, even through a closed door and window. It was about then I began seeing dark shapes moving around in that fog. They were large and quick, darting back and forth. Without thinking, I fired up the engine and laid on the horn. It must have worked because whatever was there eventually went away, and with it, so did that damn fog. As quickly as it arrived, it was gone. I have never been so happy to leave the worksite as I was that day, and I will never return to that area after what I had experienced out there. Story 2. I was camping in Big Sur, California with my partner of over 15 years for the weekend. We pretty much had the entire campground to ourselves, and chose a campsite about a half a mile from the ocean in a large open field surrounded by a thick forest. We spent that evening around the campfire, telling stories and drinking hot cocoa. Afterward, we put out the fire, climbed into our shared tent with Cookie, my 5-year-old black lab, and then we went to sleep. Around 1 a.m., something startled my dog. She's usually very calm and used to overnight camping trips in the woods, but this time she was yanking at the leash, desperately trying to get out of the tent. She pulled so hard her harness snapped, and she bolted out of the small tent opening and across the field and into the woods. Both my partner and I grabbed our lights and chased after her, and it wasn't long before we found her curled up in another clearing and had to pick her up and carry her back to the camp. This really got to us, so we decided to hide inside the tent for the rest of the night. Meanwhile, Cookie refused to lay down. Her ears were up, and her gaze remained locked on that tent wall. That's when we heard the cackling, a high-pitched laughter right outside the tent. As you might imagine, we were terrified beyond speech. And then we heard a scream following the laughter and a guttural roar. We thought at first it could have been wolves or a bear killing its prey, but it sounded far too human. We just sat there until the freakish laughter ended. A couple hours later, we broke down camp at the first opportunity and left. We never looked back following that experience. It was just plain bizarre. Story 3. My buddy Mitch and I went to Yosemite National Park last fall, and during our time there, I had an experience that left me shaken to my very core. It was early October 2019 when Mitch and I arrived at the park and decided to take a 4-mile trail from Yosemite Valley to Glacier Point. It was a moderate hiking trail that only lasts about 4.5 miles, but offers a spectacular view of pretty much all of Yosemite's finest landmarks, like El Capitan, Yosemite Falls, Half Dome, the Merced River, and Tenaya Canyon. It was a perfect sunny day, and hiking conditions were just right for the trek. But while we were up there, something really strange happened to us, and I believe things would have been much worse had we not listened to our gut instinct when we did. It was around 2 p.m. and we reached a section of the trail that gave us our first real view of Yosemite Falls, kind of near the top, with about a half a mile to go before we had to turn around and head back. We decided to stop at this point, take a breather, and admire the view before continuing further up the trail. After a moment, though, Mitch said he needed to relieve himself and backtrack down the trail to a grove of trees for a little privacy while he did his business. As he disappeared from view, I laid my blue flannel on the ground and sat down on it, facing the trail ahead. And then I saw Mitch emerge from some bushes about 20 yards in front of me. He just stopped and stared at me before speaking up. And in a calm voice, he said he needed to show me something really cool, and gestured me to follow him. But I couldn't move. I was frozen in place and extremely confused. I was just trying to figure out how he managed to get ahead of me when I specifically watched him venture down the trail. There was no way he could have snuck past me, because one side of the trail is extremely steep and dangerous, and the other side drops off hundreds of feet below. But before I could even ask how he managed to do so, he called out to me again. This time he was a bit more assertive. Still unable to move, I then heard a voice from behind me. It was Mitch asking who I was talking to. I remember feeling white as a ghost, and we both knew something wasn't right. When I turned back to look at the man ahead of me, he was gone. It wasn't Mitch after all, but some kind of copycat or impersonator, and believe me, I had a good look at the guy. I know how strange that sounds to anyone listening to this, but that was our cue to end our little adventure and head back. Initially, I thought I was hallucinating due to some elderberries I had eaten on the trail moments before. But that idea went out the window when Mitch told me that he had seen the guy as well as he came up the trail. I wasn't crazy after all. Both Mitch and I saw someone or something that tried luring me away from the trail. We were done hiking after that. Now, I've heard about people mysteriously disappearing in the park. Could my experience have something to do with this? Thanks for listening to my story, and I'd like to know if anyone else out there had anything like this happen to them. Story 4. During my hunting trip last August, I lost one of my dogs, but not the way one might expect. Nope. My 10-year-old beagle lost his life while chasing what I thought was a deer in the heart of Cascade Country, kinda over near the Klamath Falls area. It was a typical hunting trip for my 16-year-old son Jacob and I, along with our 3 dogs, Sammy, Chippy, and Beans. Beans was the leader of the pack and usually took point during most chases. Well, on that idle Tuesday afternoon, the 5 of us drove out to one of our favorite spots about 12 miles east of Lake of the Woods Resort in Oregon. Once our boots hit the ground, it wasn't long before we spotted our first buck. Unfortunately, this one disappeared before we even had the chance to pursue it. 30 minutes later, we spotted another one from the top of a ridgeline, but couldn't get close enough for a good shot. We continued on for another couple hours or so, and didn't have much luck after that. And at this point, the sun was beginning to settle, and nightfall was only about an hour away. But just as we were ready to give up and head back to the truck, I saw the biggest buck I'd ever seen. It was standing on top of a mound of boulders, looking down at us from about 100 feet away. We were actually kind of startled given its sheer size and the way it just stood there looking at us. The thing is, it didn't appear to show any fear, a clear target, and it just doesn't get any better than that. Jacob and I must have fired several rounds at it, but it didn't even budge. It continued to stand there, completely unfazed. The strangest thing was, I knew I'd hit my target at least twice, and it was as if the deer had absorbed every one of those rounds. My son and I looked at each other without muttering a single word. It was then that Bean broke from his position and beelined it toward that buck. Despite my commands to stop, he went on anyway and disobeyed me, thrashing his way up through the heavy brush, and eventually reaching the top of that very same boulder where the buck was. By that point, the deer had already retreated into the thick woods that awaited it down on the other side. As Bean gave chase, his hunting cries began to fade, and he too disappeared into those woods. Naturally, we rushed in after him with Sammy and Chippy slightly ahead of us. As we reached the top of the large rock, we could see slightly into the valley below on the other side, and what awaited us was an ocean of pristine wilderness. Hesitant at first, we slid down the steep and rocky slope and entered those woods as well. We followed both dogs deeper into the lush green darkness, and the further we went, Bean's barking grew more intense. We were getting close now. And then we heard the cries, followed by a sound that still gives me nightmares to this day. It was a sound an animal makes while being ripped apart by its predator, and it was definitely Bean making those cries. We stopped dead in our tracks, then it grew quiet. Both Sammy and Chippy were now at our sides, ears curled back and butts on the ground. They were afraid, and so were we. This was the first time we'd ever seen the dogs act like this during a hunting trip, and it was very out of character for them. We inched our way deeper into the trees until the darkness overtook us. But even in the fleeting light of day, we could still see the scene that was about to unfold. Without warning, the dogs began to growl, and instead of giving chase, they remained next to Jacob and I. And then we saw it. Movement about 15 to 20 yards away caught our attention, and it didn't take long for me to realize that it was Bean's limp and bloodied body slowly being jerked up into a tree. My first thought was a wildcat must have got to him. But we didn't see a cat. Strangest of all, we couldn't see what was doing it. All we could see was the tree and Bean's body slowly being lifted up into it, and then disappearing altogether. We gathered at the base of that dug fir and peered up for a better look, and hopefully a clear shot at whatever just killed my dog. The tree must have been 100 feet tall, and by now, Bean was so far up there that he was no longer visible. The shifting and dragging sound stopped as well, and everything grew quiet again. A little too quiet. We did a 360 walk around of the tree, but still, no sign of Bean. Where on earth could he have been? It was as if whatever had taken him just kept climbing up and never came down. We both popped off a few more rounds up into that tree to try and get some kind of reaction out of this thing. But again we were met with silence. We were completely devastated. Jacob and I remained there for another hour, using our nightlights to search every conceivable spot or crevice that Bean may have disappeared into. It was then we began to accept the reality of the situation. Bean was gone, and whatever had taken him may be back for us. So we got the hell out of there, and made our way back to civilization. I have never felt so guilty in my life as I did that night, and to this day, we leave the dogs at home during our hunting trips. I am still in disbelief from my experience, and as for Jacob, he's handling it better than me, but is still pretty shaken up about it. Looking back, there was something really creepy about that deer that we'd seen. The sheer size of it, the way it just stood there staring at us despite being shot at. It got me thinking, what if it wasn't a deer after all, but something more sinister disguised as one? Was it responsible for Bean's death and disappearance? I really believe it was. Thanks for letting me share my story. Hello, folks. Welcome back to another compilation of strange and spooky winter wilderness stories submitted by our listeners. As we begin to transition from winter to spring, many of us will find ourselves itching to get outdoors again. But before you do, you may want to take these experiences into consideration before doing so. So here you go. Last winter, I was making my way across Highway 108 inside the Stanislaus National Forest in California. I decided to pull over to stretch my legs and enjoy some sweet views of the surrounding geography. I pulled into the nearby Donald Vista Point, and even though it was middle of February, it was crystal clear and quite pleasant outside that day. From the main parking area, I walked down a short path to the observation point, where a couple of folks had gathered to enjoy the views. What was interesting was that there were no other cars in that parking lot other than mine. But I shrugged it off and just enjoyed the views as well. To the west, I can see the remnants of a recent fire that had scorched some distant woodland. Below was Middle Fork River Canyon and Donald Reservoir, and off in the backdrop was the Dardanelles. It was around 11 a.m. and the sun was nearly overhead. The older couple was about 30 feet to my right, back turned as they faced the opposite direction. But they weren't really talking or moving, just standing there motionless and staring off into the wilderness. It was like this for about 15 to 20 minutes. I noticed that the sun had dimmed, casting a large shadow over the region, and when I looked up I saw a small but thick cloud covering the sun. This also struck me as odd, as this was the only cloud in sight, and it chose to sit there hovering directly over the sun. At that moment I lowered my gaze back to the couple, and they were now gone, completely absent from the very ledge they had stood on just seconds ago. Fearing the worst, I sprinted over to that ledge and looked over it, but nothing but granite and shrub for hundreds of feet below. It didn't appear the two jumped or fell. I was perplexed. I still remember the pink polo she had on and the black and white flannel that he had been wearing. Easy to spot, you would think. That older couple, it seems, had vanished into thin air. I did a short search of that area, following the outer reaches of the observation areas, and even walked the path back to my car twice. I didn't see or hear any other vehicles, and I would eventually report my observations to the Sonora Police Department, and that was that. A later online search of the area revealed a relatively eerie find. Several people went missing in that area in recent times, but I couldn't find anything about a missing couple. That's all I've got. Thank you. Story 2. In February of 2009, I had a pretty wild experience during a short day hike inside the Red River Gorge Park in Kentucky, a place I had been to on a few different occasions. I always went solo, but this time I decided to bring along my 5-year-old son. I wanted to get him familiar to the area as we were considering moving to a nearby town in the coming months. It was a cold and overcast afternoon, around 2 p.m. when Gray and I entered the Whittleton Arch Trail, which is an easy 2.5-mile trek that offers stunning geological views and perfect for a youngin' with the energy level of an atomic bomb. I would let him wander a bit ahead of me on the trail, maybe about 20 feet or so. He'd stop, pick up random objects on the ground, and toss them back into the nearby forest. Well, once we passed the iconic Whittleton Arch, I saw something strange. As usual, my son was jumping and skipping ahead of me on the trail, when I noticed a dark shadow, about the size of a grown man, jet up to gray, and then leap back into the woods again. Immediately, I shouted for him to stop, before running up and grabbing the boy's hand. I turned my attention to the surrounding woods, spent about a minute trying to confirm what I had just seen. Nothing. It happened so quickly, I could barely remember the details. Just a shadow of a man that seemed a bit opaque and quicker than hell. I remember asking myself, did I imagine the whole thing? I know what I saw, so I turned around and we began walking back toward the parking area. My son kept asking why we were heading back, but I told him not to worry and that he wasn't in any trouble. I continued watching our surroundings. A few minutes later, I let go of his hand as I knew we were getting close to the trailhead. And then it happened again. Gray was only about 10 feet ahead of me this time, when a shadowy figure shot out of the woodline and lashed itself onto my son. But he didn't even notice. I found myself running up to Gray while yelling obscenities at this thing. It seemed to notice my presence because it sprinted back into the woodline when it saw me approaching. This time I picked up my son and ran the rest of the way back. I would eventually tell him that there was a wild cat in the area just to soothe his curiosities, but I knew better. This figure gave me quite a fright, and whatever it was doing or trying to do with my son wasn't good. It was interested in him only, much like that of a mountain lion stalking the weakest of the herd. At least that's the feeling I got from it. It wasn't standing upright either, but more like a shadow of something that was. It was just the shadow, and that's it. I'm still scratching my head over this experience. If anyone else out there had a similar sighting, I'd like to know. Thank you. Story 3. A couple of years ago, I had what some might call an extraordinary experience out in the redwoods of Mendocino County, California. It was a cold January day, and I decided to partake in one of my favorite hobbies, tree climbing. I've been doing it since college, and not only was it a great way to get in shape, but the reward was often worth it, offering stunning views and unique perspectives. So I stopped in over at Richardson's Grove State Park, an exceptional grove of lowland redwoods that hugs the Eel River, which is located just off Highway 101. I realize my hobby isn't exactly recommended by park officials, but I do it anyway, and I've never been caught. I suppose that's half the thrill for me, but hey, I could be doing worse things out there in those parks. Once I parked my car, I hacked into a section of the park not easily accessible or seen by many visitors, that overlooks a stunning section of the Eel River. It's a bit of a challenge to get back in there, but at least I was confident that I could climb in peace. I usually choose smaller or younger growth because, let's face it, it's both an easier and far less dangerous climb. It was long before I spotted my tree, a young and healthy 75-foot-tall marvel. For the first 15 feet or so, I inched my way up the branchless trunk until I reached the first set of branches. Before I continued on, I stopped to rest and take a look around the surrounding forest. It was calm and quiet. Lush green canopies hung over the red carpets of earth below. It was gorgeous. Next, I adjusted my equipment, and the real climbing began. I crawled my way upward through the jungle gym of knobs and branches, occasionally picking off insects and debris. Then I heard a strange sound emanating from the forest around me. It was a loud burst of what sounded like laughter. Short but quite noticeable, even through the scratching and climbing sounds I was making. It was enough to get me to stop and examine the nearby trees, as it almost seemed to be coming from the ones right next to mine. I was about 50 feet up now, with about another 25 feet to go. Maybe it was a bird I was hearing, so I shrugged it off and continued on up. About 15 minutes later, I'm pretty much at my final destination. Any further up, and the branches would be too fragile to hold my weight. But there I was, overlooking that beautiful Yellow River, as the sun decided to punch a hole through the afternoon fog, just long enough to paint the surrounding landscape in vibrant shades of pine and mahogany. Not long after, the fog returned, and there went the sun. I took another several minutes to enjoy the views, snack on a power bar, and swim in my achievements. I decided it was time to head back down. As I began to lower myself, my attention was drawn to the tops of those nearby trees, at around the same level as the one I was in. These were about 20 to 30 feet away from me, but then I noticed something move at the top of one of those trees. It took me a moment to realize that it was another man. I got a cold shiver when I realized this man was watching me. Upon closer inspection, the guy was the spitting image of me. A thin build, reddish beard, and short but shaggy hair. He even wore the same style and color of clothes I was wearing. What were the chances of that? I told myself in utter amazement. But as I sat there, perched up in that tree, the man continued to stare. When I shifted, he seemed to shift too. And when I waved to the guy, he did the same, at the exact same time. It was like looking at a mirror image of myself sitting in that neighboring tree. But then it was dawning on me that the guy was mimicking my every move. And suddenly, my curiosities turned into fear when he stopped moving, even though I kept going. He was stuck frozen in place, and his eyes grew large before bellowing out the most sinister of laughter I have ever heard, followed by these animalistic grunting noises. It was then my adrenaline kicked in and I began to descend as quickly as I could, as I was nearly free climbing at this point, but something told me I had to get out of there fast. Everything about this guy was wrong. I was so dead set on my descent that I never even stopped to listen if he was doing the same. It wasn't long before I leapt onto the forest floor. Nearly out of steam now, I ran as quickly as I could back to the car, but not before I noticed a shower of debris raining down, and then my observation seemed to confirm my fears. The man was in my tree, and he was making his way down quickly. I don't know how he did it, but somehow he managed to jump from his neighboring tree to mine, and now he was definitely following me. At that point, I abandoned my bag full of gear and sprinted back to the car. 5 minutes later, I'm in my car and back on the road, completely numb from my frightening experience. It took a long time to process this. I had heard many strange stories people have had while out in the wilderness, but after a certain point, it almost becomes just that, stories. But never did I imagine I'd find myself sharing my own bizarre encounter. Does anyone out there know or have an idea of what I saw? Thank you, Andy. Story 4. I own a small dog-sitting business out in Colorado, And on this particular weekend, I was sitting one of my regulars, Bark, a quiet 2-year-old lab mixed mutt who was always quite a pleasure to have along for adventures. It was a cold winter's day when I decided to bring Bark out on a short day's hike near the Rockies at a place called Kruger Rock Trail, a 1,300-acre dog-friendly campground and RV area with a variety of smaller trails that offers rewarding views of Mount Meeker, the Continental Divide, and Mummy Range. I decided to take the two of us up the 2-mile trail and back on a cold but sunny afternoon. There was a fresh layer of snow on the ground from the day before, but it wasn't that deep at all, maybe about an inch or less. Well, after enjoying Kruger's views, we set back toward the trailhead, but on the way back something really odd happened out there. About halfway back, Bark stopped on the trail, kind of between two boulders, and refused to go any further, even when I escorted him to move on by jerking his leash. He just stood there, stared, ears in reverse. I then noticed some movement coming from a tree limb hanging over the trail about 15 feet up and about 20 feet ahead of us. The branch just sprang up and down slowly, like something was perched up on top of it. I just assumed a large bird had been there seconds before flying off. But that didn't explain why Bark was so hesitant to leave that spot. Eventually I got him to follow, even though he would go, stop, and then repeat the process. There was maybe only 5 people on the trail during that time we were there, so it was pretty quiet overall. But I remember getting this uneasy feeling as we continued walking back. We were about 10 minutes away when I remember pulling on Bark's leash to catch up with me, as he continued to resist. And then it happened. As I went to tug on his leash once again, I felt nothing on the other end, a complete weightlessness that I was not prepared for. And then I spun around to see that Bark had completely vanished. His collar was still perfectly attached to the leash, but that was it. I immediately called out for several minutes straight, thinking maybe the guy had leapt into the nearby woods or backtracked to chase some critter. But the only set of paw prints I saw in that snow were the ones going forward on the trail, intertwined with mine. I was perplexed. No other prints, no sounds, no barking, no warning. Bark was just gone. I remained on that trail for another hour or so before the sun made its evening descent, and it grew quite cold and windy, and I had to stop looking as darkness was right around the corner, and I didn't have a flashlight. As you might imagine, I was a bit frantic. I eventually made my way back to the trailhead, spent another hour calling out for Bark before finally leaving, but not before stopping at the visitor center on my way out of the park. But standing there inside the main info center was Bark. I explained to the park employee what had happened, and he too was as stumped as I was, especially given that Bark was found 12 miles away in the opposite direction, wandering through someone else's campsite. Lucky for me, the family at that campsite returned him to the visitor center, not knowing what to do with them. But I'm quite shocked how this could have happened in a short amount of time. But I guess I'm one of the lucky ones, ain't I? I'm just happy I didn't have to make that phone call to his owners. Reese. Story 5. Back in the winter of 2018, when I was in college, me and the oldest took off to a lake in the wilds of Glacier County. I have extensive backcountry exposure, even did a stint as a big game guide in a remote backcountry camp, But on this day, we did a little camping, hiking, and fishing, and then settled in for the night. I pulled out my pan and stoked up a nice fire. It was clear and cool as the sun faded into the western slopes. We cooked up some fresh rainbow trout with garlic and butter and filled our stomachs. I leaned back against the cooler after putting out a refreshing beverage. The boy was soon asleep by the fire, as it had been a busy day. I sipped my beer and watched the moonlight bouncing off the little waves in the lake. There was still a glow on the western horizon where the sun had gone down, and I could see the outline of the mountain peaks towering over the little lake. I slowly faded off to sleep with the sound of the lake waves gently lapping on the rocks. But not long after, I awoke abruptly. The fire was out, the lantern was too, the moon was gone, and it was pitch black. But I knew something was wrong. The hair on the back of my neck stood out straight, and I was paralyzed. I could hear my heart thumping as I strained to hear something in the bushes, but it was so quiet. A horrible, uneasy feeling fell upon me, and I gathered myself together and started kicking around the fire. A small flame came alive, and I quickly threw on some kindling. In that small fire, I could see that my boy had awoken, and was shocked to see his wide-open eyes staring at me, asking, "What's wrong?" "Nothing. Go climb in the tent," I told him, and I reassured him that everything was fine. He made his way into the tent, but even in the light of the fire, I couldn't shake my weariness. Something was out there in those bushes. It's a feeling I'd never had before, and given all the days and nights I spent out in the wilderness, this seemed quite different and shocking to me. I gathered up my light and flashed around camp. Nothing. Finally, I began to calm down and crawled into the tent with my son. Then again, like clockwork, I awoke completely tense. This time I couldn't shake the feeling I was getting. I finally instructed the boy to wake up and to get into the truck. I quickly packed up all of our camping gear and drove to the other side of the lake, where we would sleep in the truck until the wee hours of the morning. At the first light, I got up and looked across the lake where we had been camping earlier, and another uneasy feeling came over me. I decided it was time to go home. I don't know what was out there, but I know my gut instincts, and something was wrong with that place. Whatever it was, I will leave it to your imagination, but it creeps me out to this day to think about it, and I believe that my gut instinct may have saved our lives. I just can't explain it. Thank you for sharing my story, Forrest. As we begin to make our way into the dead of a new winter, I thought I'd share a few strange and spooky stories sent to me by our listeners. So bring the dog and cat in, lock your doors, and throw another log on that fire, 'cause tonight, it's storytelling time. Story 2. Early one morning, I got up to make coffee before work at 6 a.m. I remember glancing out my kitchen window, only to see a child frolicking through a blanket of cold February fog. Sounds normal enough, right? Wrong. I live alone with my 5-year-old cat Smokey, a sensitive little gray tabby that was more human than he was cat. Best roommate ever, I should add. The child, who appeared to be wearing a white button-up collared shirt and dark slacks, seemed unusually dressed for the random occasion of being out in 30-degree temperatures. My first thoughts were, do I have company? But upon stepping out the front door, I was met with silence. I should add that my nearest neighbor lives about a half a mile from me, and he has no children. So who was this kid, and why was he out there? At the furthest edge of the field was a curtain of trees that separated my property from privately owned farmland that was protected by an electric fence. This was to keep his livestock from escaping and to keep predators out. Mountain lions were also an issue in the past, and if any parent knew this, they sure as hell wouldn't let their kids running amok all alone out there. Well, as you might imagine, I called it in. If someone's child was missing, I couldn't sit by idle and do nothing. Sheriff's Department stated that nobody had reported a child missing. So after a bit, we all assumed the child belonged to a family that must have been traveling through. But if there were any vehicles that entered my property, I would have heard. The gravel road would have demonstrated that, as it does every time somebody comes down my road. But this was different. The child was gone as quickly as he appeared, almost ghost-like, now that I think about it. Now here's where things get a little eerie. I returned home from work that night only to find an empty house. Smokey somehow had vanished. I left the house that morning as Smokey was eating his favorite kibble. That was the last image I had of him. I spent a week searching every crevice in my small manufactured home, thinking maybe he'd fallen ill or hid somewhere, as they sometimes do. That was nearly a year ago now. As you might imagine, I was devastated by this, but learned to accept what had happened, and that it was out of my control. Smokey was an indoor cat only, and even when presented with the opportunity to go outside, he never did. He preferred to sit at the doorway and stare out instead. He was that kind of cat that would never leave the home, even if you left all the windows and doors wide open. So that brings me to my next thought. Could there be a connection between the mysterious child and my missing cat? Did the child somehow break into my secured home while I was out at work, only to steal Smokey, who usually hid from company and strangers? Logic tells me otherwise, but when you have one strange event that directly follows another, I can't help but wonder if it's anything other than a coincidence. I know you've done videos in the past about missing pets, so I thought I'd reach out about mine. Happy New Year to you, Rusty, and thanks. J.B. Palmer. Story 3. I'm an ex-geologist, and several years ago, I was mapping one winter on the tundra in northern Quebec, approximately 150 to 200 kilometers from the nearest town. And I mean in the middle of nowhere. No cabins, no ATV routes, no trails, nothing. Well, my field partner and I were walking along when he flipped a rock with his foot. Just a random rock out of millions. When a little piece of paper flies up from underneath it and gets caught by the wind. He turns to me and we both go, "What the bleep?" Because there should be no paper just randomly there. I track down the paper and find that it's folded. I open it up and see that it's a note with the words, quote, JETAIME on it with a drawn heart. Upon seeing this, I literally got chills up and down my spine, because the improbability of it floating all the way up here, being undamaged by the elements, and then us finding it randomly, is just mind-blowing. Well, the whole way back that evening, we kept hearing what sounded like ice and rock shifting and sliding behind us as if we were being trailed. And it sounded close, but just far enough out of view that we could never really see where it was coming from. I doubt this had anything to do with that bizarre note, but thought I'd mention it anyway. The words or letters didn't make a lick of sense to us, even after Googling it. But it does look French. As for the heart drawn around the letters, this may have been somebody's love note. But again, all the way out here in the middle of nowhere, and not a single sign of damage either. Amazing. Now, I'm not a religious man, or superstitious by any means, but it felt like the universe or some higher power just reached out and poked me in the chest. That's it. I thought I'd share that with ya. Thank you, Tom and Scott. Story 4. Hello, Rusty. I've got 2 strange experiences I'd like to share with you. Here's the first. This past winter, I hiked a very high peak with a buddy of mine and camped out overnight. Everything was fine the first day we were there. We had a great night's sleep and woke up early to hike back to the parking area. On the way back down the trail, my friend and I noticed someone else had been hiking as well. About a mile after walking, I stopped and saw my full name, first and last, was drawn into the snow on the side of a footpath. Well, I sure as hell didn't do that, and neither did my friend. It was snowing a bit throughout the night, and if it was drawn the day before, well, the snow would have covered it up. We got a bit freaked out and decided to hustle back to our car so we could get out of there. We finally got back to the parking area, and I went to sign myself out of the registry book. When I turned the page to where I had signed in the previous day, I saw that someone else had scribbled out all my information so you couldn't read it anymore. No one else had signed into the book besides myself for 3 days. I will not be going back there. And here's the next experience I had. A few days after Christmas of 2018, my family and I went to gather up all our Christmas decorations before the next big snow. We live at the end of a quiet rural street in South Dakota, and other than the mailman, we just don't see many folks come down this far. Well, as we went to gather up some of the larger decorations that we had placed on our roof, including a 7-foot snowman and a large wooden Santa with reindeer, well, we saw that they had vanished. Well, this had us all scratching our heads, especially with the Santa and the reindeer decorations, which weighed about 75 pounds. There's no way our 2 young children could have taken it, and it's hard to imagine a storm having anything to do with it. And we had just seen them the day before as well. A few months go by, and we find them at the very back end of the property, which is around 40 acres in size. They were found sitting neatly, placed in a thick group of trees. No damage. No other sign anyone was there. Just the snowmen and the Santa decorations, exactly how we remembered them from last Christmas. Well, that really blew our minds, And to this day, we still talk about it. Anyway, thank you for sharing my experiences with your listeners, and Happy New Year to ya. Lance K. As those colder months begin to descend upon us, the winter wilderness becomes an enigmatic canvas where chilling mysteries intertwine with snug tales by the fire. Gather closely for a medley of spine-tingling experiences whispered by those who have wandered through the gauntlet of high strangeness. From shadowy figures in the woods to hushed whispers on the howling winds, these first-hand encounters will transport you to a world where the mystical and the macabre collide. So here you go. Story 1. Well, I never thought a simple trip to a rest area would forever haunt me. It was just another ordinary day when I stopped at an old rest area in Wyoming with my loyal companion, Mickey. As I opened the car door, Mickey excitedly jumped out and wagged his tail, leaping around us as if he had stumbled upon a gold mine of sense. I let him explore for a few moments, but as I turned around to leash him, he vanished into thin air. Panic surged through my veins as I frantically searched the area, calling his name repeatedly, but there was no trace of him. Days turned into weeks, and the once vivacious rest area transformed into a foreboding place in my mind. I mourned the loss of Mickey, accepting the cruel reality that he was gone forever. Then, one evening, something inexplicable occurred. As I sat in my living room, a scratching noise emerged from the front door. Reluctantly, I opened it, praying to see my beloved pet standing there, and there he was. Mickey, in perfect condition, as if nothing had happened. He traveled over 700 miles to get here, and you wouldn't even know it. But deep down, I could feel a gnawing unease. Though physically unharmed, Mickey's behavior had drastically changed. He no longer wagged his tail in excitement or showered me with his customary affection. Instead, he stared at me with startling intensity, his eyes a chilling shade of icy blue. His once cheerful demeanor had transformed into an unsettling calmness. It was as if his essence had been replaced by something unfamiliar. Something sinister lurking beneath the surface. Well, my heart sank, and I couldn't shake the distinct feeling that this was not the same dog I had known and loved for years. Night after night, I found myself haunted by Mickey's unsettling transformation. His once melodic bark had turned into a low, guttural growl that would send shivers down my spine. Suspicion clouded my mind, as I couldn't help but wonder what had transpired during the time he had vanished. Had he encountered something malevolent in that rest area? Did he bring it back with him? Amidst the eerie silence of our home, I couldn't escape the feeling that Mickey's return had brought something sinister into our lives. We eventually took Mickey to the vet for examination. Other than the odd behavior, he was given a clean bill of health. This was last October, and since then, well, not much has changed. In a way, it feels as though Mickey is still gone, yet replaced by something else entirely. I still don't know how to process it, but sharing this story with your listeners has been somewhat therapeutic for me. So thank you, Rusty, and happy holidays. Story 2. I woke up early that cold December morning, eager to go on an adventure with my partner Sarah. We had heard rumors about an abandoned bike trail hidden deep in the California woods, and we couldn't resist the chance to explore it. As we arrived at the trailhead, the temperature dropped significantly. Ignoring the discomfort, we began to follow the overgrown path. As we walked deeper into the woods, the silence became deafening. Not a single chirp or rustle of the leaves could be heard. The only sound that resonated was the distant hum of a foreboding wind. It felt as though the entire forest was holding its breath. Unease settled in my gut, but I pushed it aside, determined to revel in the adventure. As we continued, the dense trees overhead formed a canopy, obscuring the morning sunlight. Shadows danced ominously among the trunks, adding to our trepidation. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement among the trees. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. I whispered to Sarah, "Did you see that?" She nodded, her face pale, and voice barely audible. We quickened our pace, feeling the weight of unseen eyes following our every move. Suddenly, a bone-chilling howl echoed throughout the forest, freezing us in our tracks. The hair on the back of our necks stood up, and panic welled within. We instinctively knew we were being hunted, but there was no way of knowing by what. Fear consumed us, propelling us forward in a frenzied rush. It felt as though the woods themselves were closing in on us, trapping us in this haunting nightmare. Gasping for breath, we finally burst out of the tree line onto the safety of a nearby road. We glanced back but saw nothing. It was as if the terror had dissolved as quickly as it began, leaving us dazed and bewildered. We vowed never to speak of that trail again, as if uttering that name would invite us back into the darkness that lurked within. From that day forward, we never doubted the existence of what dwelled among the trees, forever haunted by the memories of that cold December morning in California. Story 3. As a park ranger who's worked for the National Park Service for over 25 years, I had grown accustomed to the solitude and quiet of the Oregonian wilderness. It was a cold, wintry evening when I found myself as the last one to leave the ranger station, just as the ominous storm clouds started to roll in. The station sat nestled deep in the heart of Ponderosa Pine Forest, surrounded by towering trees and an eerie silence. As I prepared to lock up for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, causing the branches to creak in protest. The temperatures dropped rapidly, and a thick fog began to envelop the area, reducing visibility to almost nothing. As I made my way to the rig, I heard some strange rustling sounds coming from the darkness. I turned on my flashlight and scanned the perimeter, but all I could see were shadows dancing in the quickly fading light. With a shiver down my spine, I quickly unlocked the car and jumped in, eager to escape the unsettling atmosphere. But as I turned the key in the ignition, I caught a glimpse of a figure standing beneath the tree. Its eyes glowing with an unearthly red color. Its presence exuded inexplicable malevolence, and I could feel its gaze burning through me. As I sped away from the ranger station, panic and fear consumed me. What had I just witnessed? The storm intensified, unleashing its fury upon the land, but my mind was consumed with thoughts of that haunting figure. Was it a trick of the imagination or something far more sinister? I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was somehow connected to the approaching blizzard, as if it were intended to unleash chaos along with the raging snowfall. As the storm raged on, I couldn't help but wonder if I had truly escaped, or if that eerie figure would haunt my dreams forever. It was a chilling reminder that even in the dark embrace of nature, there are forces we just can't comprehend. The blizzard may have brought isolation and harsh conditions, but the true terror lay in the unknown, leaving me to wonder what secrets the forest held, and if I would ever truly be safe again. That's my experience. Thank you for sharing, Rusty. Ron the Ranger. Story 4. Hello, Rusty. Name's Kai. I wanted to share an experience I had recently that forever changed me and my perception of the outdoors. As I embarked on my solo hike along the Appalachian Trail, I couldn't help but feel a sense of serenity and excitement. The lush greenery of that forest filled my senses, and the crisp air invigorated me with each step. Little did I know that this picturesque setting would soon become a nightmare I couldn't escape. It all began innocuously enough, a momentary distraction as I checked the time on my cell phone. But as I looked up, disorientation consumed me. The trail seemed unfamiliar, the landscape shifted, and I felt a chill working its way down my back. I tried retracing my steps, desperate to find my way back to familiar territory. But no matter how far I walked, it felt as though I was trapped in an eerie time loop. The forest around me morphed and distorted with each loop, taking on sinister undertones. Shapes and shadows danced in the corners of my vision, whispering secrets I couldn't decipher. Every rustle of the leaves sent my heart racing, unsure of what awaited me beyond the trees. In that daunting hour, the forest revealed its true nature. Bizarre phenomena unfolded all around me. Trees twisted and contorted in unnatural forms, as if they were sentient beings watching my every move. Unearthly cries pierced the silence, their origins concealed within the dense foliage. I saw glimpses of figures darting between the shadows, their eyes gleaming with an otherworldly intensity. Time stretched thin as the boundary between reality and nightmare blurred. Finally, by a stroke of luck or perhaps sheer will, I stumbled upon a path I hadn't seen before. My feet propelled me forward, fueled by fear and determination, as I raced towards what I hoped would bring me freedom. And as I burst through the tree line onto an open meadow, the time loop shattered like fragile glass. Gasping for air, I collapsed on the grass, the forest behind me eerily silent once again. Though I had escaped the clutches of that sinister loop, the memory of those strange occurrences will forever linger in the depths of my hiker's soul. I returned home a changed man not long after that, and to this day, I'm at a loss for words to describe what occurred out there on that cold December afternoon. Thank you, Kai. Story 5. My name's Juan, and I've been a pilot for over a decade, soaring through the skies without a care in the world. But nothing could have prepared me for that fateful night in February, flying over the remote parts of Washington State. The frigid darkness surrounded my private plane, casting eerie shadows on the ground below. As I navigated through the chilly night, my plane began to behave strangely, shuddering as if in protest against the inky void beyond. The controls grew unresponsive, contradicting my every instinct. panic coursed through my veins, gradually replacing the confidence I once held so dear. I tried desperately to re-establish communication with the nearby airports. Static filled my headphones. The unsettling absence of any response added an extra layer of fear to the already tense situation. Was I truly alone in this vast expanse of darkness and silence? That's when I saw it. A figure lurking in the back seat. My eyes widened in horror, my body frozen with terror. The silhouette of it was indistinct, barely visible in the dim green glow of the instrument panel. And when our eyes met, time seemed to stand still as a silent understanding passed between us. Without a second thought, I made the decision to land the plane immediately. Even in that cold cabin, sweat dripped from my forehead as I fought the uncooperative controls, desperately attempting to guide my aircraft toward the nearest airport. As the wheels touched the ground, relief washed over me, but a lingering sense of unease remained. Exiting the plane, trembling with equal parts fear and curiosity, I turned to face the back seat. To my astonishment, it was empty. The figure had vanished, leaving behind an inexplicable sense of dread. The subsequent investigation proved fruitless, offering no explanations for the strange events that had transpired. The plane, a newer Cessna 172, never had any issues before, and I am the sole owner. Now, if it were an older plane, I could probably chalk it up to some haunting or bad energy by a former pilot or something. But again, no viable explanation for the experience. And to this day, the memory of that eerie flight haunts my dreams, awakening a primal fear deep within. The remote parts of the Washington State wilderness hold a secret, one that refuses to be divulged, reminding me that there are forces in this world that we can never truly comprehend. All those crazy stories I've heard over the years about pilots seeing and experiencing odd things, well, it doesn't seem so crazy to me now. Anywho, that's my experience. Thank you for sharing, Rusty. I appreciate your work. Best, Juan. Hello, folks. Welcome back to another chillin' installment from the Winter Wilderness series, where strange encounters lurk beneath layers of frost and snow. In this compilation of odd and eerie experiences, we delve even deeper into the dark realms of mysteries delivered by our listeners. From the inexplicable howls echoing through the glacial night to ghostly shadows dancing amidst the frozen trees, these tales paint an eerie portrait of the winter wilderness that continues to descend upon us in the coming months. So here you go. Story 1. I had always found solace in the raw beauty of the winter wilderness of Colorado. As a park ranger, I cherished the solitude that came with the endless snowy fields and towering evergreen trees. But one winter, an eerie incident unfolded that shook me to the core and left an indelible mark on my psyche. It was a bitterly cold night, and I was patrolling the Rocky Mountains National Park alone, bundled up in countless layers of clothing. The only sound that reached my ears was the haunting howl of the wind as it whipped through the trees. Shadows danced in the pale moonlight, that loomed overhead, crafting grotesque figures that seemed to leer at me from the surrounding darkness. Suddenly, a gut-churning shiver ran down my spine, and I felt an inexplicable presence watching my every move. Ignoring the feeling, I continued my patrol, but my unease grew with every passing step. As I arrived at the deserted campsite that I was called in to check on, I felt the adrenaline coursing through my veins. The fire smoldered, its only remnants being scattered embers and fragments of something like hair. Cautiously, I brushed away the snow, revealing a name tag buried beneath it. It read, Park Ranger John. Well, my breath caught in my throat as I realized that this was the same exact name tag I had lost 2 weeks back. The coincidence was chilling, leaving me to ponder the implications. Well, days turned into weeks, and the odd occurrences continued. My patrol routes were frequently beset by strange footprints leading to nowhere, and whispers that only the wind seemed to carry. I would find pieces of equipment missing, only to stumble upon them in inexplicable locations. It was as if an invisible force reveled in taunting me, leaving me little room to deny the supernatural nature of these happenings. With each passing night, my sleep grew fitful, plagued by vivid nightmares and a perpetual feeling of being watched. Isolated in the vastness of the winter wilderness, I couldn't shake the sinking sensation that something dark and malevolent lurked beyond the shadows. Its icy grip tightened with every evolving coincidence. To this day, I can't shake off the disturbing thought that these eerie occurrences were more than just mere coincidences. Every winter, as the snow blankets the wilderness, I can't help but wonder what malevolent entity resides within, patiently awaiting its next chance to prey upon an unsuspecting victim. Thank you, Ranger John. Story 2. As I trudged through the thick snowfall, the biting cold of the Alaskan winter clawed at every inch of my exposed skin. My companion Jake and I had ventured to the most remote reaches of the wilderness, seeking solace and tranquility. Little did we know that we were about to stumble upon an encounter that would forever haunt our dreams. In the distance, we spotted a dilapidated cabin, long abandoned and slowly succumbing to the unforgiving elements. The atmosphere grew increasingly eerie as we approached, our visible breath mingling with the eerie silence. Through the frost-covered windows, I caught a glimpse of something deeply unsettling. Strange, ragged furs draped around the room, and the scent of decay lingered in the frigid air. Curiosity drove us closer, and as we pushed open the creaking door, our senses were immediately assaulted by an overwhelming stench. The sight before us, row upon row, meticulously arranged animal bones. Deer, elk, bear, and even the remains of mountain lions lay strewn across the floor. Besides the macabre collection, a journal lay half hidden under a layer of dust. Trembling, I picked it up and began reading its pages. The entry spoke of twisted obsession, an insatiable hunger for power. Scrawled on the pages were the chilling words, quote, "I am one with the wilderness. Its creatures are mine to claim," end quote. Well, as you might imagine, goosebumps raced up and down my spine, and an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach intensified. With every turn of the page, the author's maniacal words revealed a descent into madness. desperate to escape the clutches of the sinister cabin, while Jake and I stumbled outside, grasping for fresh air. As we quickly made our way back through the snow-covered wilderness, every snap of a branch, every rustle of the leaves became a haunting echo in our minds. We couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, pursued by the very wilderness that the deranged author had claimed as his own. The shadows seemed to dance and writhe, whispering secrets that we could only hear, tormenting us with their ceaseless presence. Days turned into weeks, yet the unsettling encounter in those remote reaches of Alaska stayed with us. Our once adventurous spirits were forever dampened by the icy grip of that cabin, its secrets etched permanently into our souls. No longer could we find solace and tranquility in the wild, for the unknown terrors lurking just out of sight had forever tainted our perception of the world around us. Thank you, Devin and Jake. Story 3. Hello, Rusty. Well, here's an experience I had last winter. I thought I'd share with you and your listeners. Here's my experience as I recall it. Well, as the winter evening settled in and the dark clouds loomed above, I ventured out for a peaceful walk with my loyal companion, my dog Colby. The air felt thick that night with an eerie stillness, almost as if nature itself had held its breath in anticipation for what was to come. Well, as we strolled down the deserted path, a strange sensation tingled at the back of my neck, causing me to glance uneasily over my shoulder. And Colby, well, he was on edge as well, constantly darting back and forth, glancing into the woods nearby. But to my shock, I noticed a faint glow emerging from behind a dense wall of trees. Alerting my dog with a low whistle, we turned our attention towards the source. There, emerging from the shadows, were a cluster of unidentified flying objects, silently advancing toward us. Each object resembled a sleek metallic saucer, shimmering with an otherworldly glow. Their form was barely visible against the darkening sky, leaving an unsettling and indescribable presence in their wake. As these uncanny UFOs hovered closer, the thin veil of silence was shattered only by the distant rumblings of an approaching storm. The hair on my dog's back stood on end, mirroring the unease that crept within inside me. Strangely, there were no lights or sounds emanating from this eerie squadron. It was as if they were stealthily gliding through the air, observing our every move with unnerving curiosity. Attempting to rationalize their presence, I sped up our pace. Yet the UFOs matched our every stride, persistently maintaining their distance. The once familiar path now felt foreign and unwelcoming, as if nature itself conspired against our escape from these intruders. My mind raced with unanswerable questions. Who piloted these unknown objects? What was their purpose for seeking me out during this desolate winter evening? As the storm overhead grew, casting an ominous darkness upon the landscape, well, the UFOs retreated one by one, vanishing into the chaos of wind and rain. Although they disappeared, their unsettling presence lingered in the atmosphere. Shaken but relieved, my dog and I hastened our steps homeward, haunted by the surreal encounter and the lingering questions that may forever remain unanswered. That's my experience. Thank you, Rusty. Chet and Colby. Story 4. As I embarked on a long drive through the desolate stretches of Wyoming one winter day in February, I couldn't help but feel a sense of adventure mixed in with a hint of trepidation. The snow-covered landscape stretched endlessly before me, the only sign of life being the occasional isolated farmhouse. Little did I know that this journey would soon take an unexpected turn. At the first stop, I noticed a figure in the distance, standing by the side of the highway. The hitchhiker was dressed in tattered clothes, his unkempt hair whipping in the icy wind. There was something eerily familiar about this guy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen him before. Ignoring the unease gnawing at me, I continued on, putting the strange encounter out of my mind. However, to my bewilderment, the same hitchhiker appeared at the second stop. This time, his cold, piercing eyes bore into mine, as if he knew my deepest secrets. His presence felt like a dark cloud hanging over my every move. A chill ran down my spine as I hurriedly got back into my car from the rest area. I couldn't resist the temptation to confront the mysterious hiker as I arrived at the third stop. Bracing myself against the biting wind, I cautiously approached the stranger. His thin lips curled into a chilling smile, his voice carrying a haunting familiarity as he whispered, "We meet again." Paralyzed by fear, I stumbled back into my car. Who was this enigmatic stranger, and why did he seem to be following me? Well, as the sun began to drop, darkness engulfed the desolate landscape. Thoughts of the hitchhiker haunted my mind with every passing mile, weaving their way into my every thought. Terrified, I focused on reaching my destination, speeding along the empty roads. Finally, as I pulled into the last stop before reaching safety, I let out a sigh of relief. The hitchhiker was nowhere to be seen. Although I reached my destination unharmed, the haunting image of that stranger lingered in my memory. To this day, even as time passes, the lingering questions remain. Was he a mere figment of my imagination? Or did that freezing winter day mark an encounter with something explicable? The mystery of the creepy hitchhiker will forever haunt the remote reaches of Wyoming in my mind, reminding me that some experiences cannot be easily explained or forgotten. Thanks for sharing my story, Rusty. I appreciate it. Bill. Story 5. Hi, Rusty. My experience reminded me of the story you once told about two guys who went out for a hike in the middle of nowhere and discovered pieces of an old boat scattered throughout the woods. Well, my experience is not too different from theirs. I was a seasoned sailor. My boat was my pride and joy, and I took her out every few days or so. But one summer night, as I lay in my berth, I heard an eerie whisper drifting through the air. It was as if the voices of the night were warning me of an impending doom. I brushed off the feeling, convincing myself it was just the wind playing tricks on my mind. However, little did I know, that night would be the last time I would see my boat at the docks. Well, the next morning I stumbled down to the marina, feeling a sense of unease. I hadn't slept much the night before, as something was weighing heavily on my mind, but I couldn't figure out what that something was. My pulse quickened as I approached the spot where my boat should have been, only to find emptiness. Well, I looked everywhere, asked a few of the other folks that were down at the marina, but nobody had seen my boat. Panic consumed me, along with anger, as I suspected it had been stolen. I immediately reported the disappearance to the authorities, But days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and still no trace of my beloved vessel. It was as if the sea had swallowed her up. But then, one winter's day, I received a call from the authorities. My boat had been found, but not where anyone could have possibly imagined. Military planes conducting exercises over the dense forests of New York had stumbled upon it, nearly 200 miles inland. Now, how in the hell did it end up there in the dead of winter remained a mystery to me and to everybody involved. No signs of forced transport or tread upon the snowy ground surrounding it. It was in pristine condition, exactly how I left it, yet its presence in such a desolate place sent shivers down my spine. Experts and investigators were also perplexed, unable to provide any logical explanation. Whispers of supernatural forces and cursed waters haunted the minds of the locals. But as for me, the eerie whisper I had once disregarded now echoed in my nightmares. The question of how the vessel ended up there will always haunt my mind. I am in the process of reaching out to some folks who may be able to help remove it, but until then, well, it's still out there. Well, that's my story, and I appreciate you sharing it. I'll let you know if anything changes, Rusty. Thank you, Lonnie. As those cold winter months begin to move on in, I thought I'd share a few more spooky winter wilderness experiences sent to me by our listeners. So bring the dog inside, lock your doors, get settled in, and throw another log on that fire. 'Cause tonight, it's storytelling time. Story 1. Hi there, Rusty. I wanted to share an odd and unnerving experience that I had recently during one of my wilderness adventures. It was a cold February morning and the air was crisp as I set out on my electric scooter along the Old Mill Trail near Redding, California. This was both my first and last time on that trail. My plan was to ride out 5 miles before returning. I had a 48-volt battery that was fully charged and ready for the adventure. So as my scooter propelled me deeper into the wilderness, I was filled with excitement and anticipation for the little off-roading adventure. But as I rolled along, a random chill crept down my spine, followed by the sensation of being observed. I brushed it off, attributing it to the solitude of the place. After all, I was the only one out there as far as I knew. Fast forward a couple miles. At one point I rolled to a stop so that I could appreciate the natural beauty all around me. As I parked the scooter to get off, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. Something tall and tan darting behind a cluster of trees, about 100 feet away or so. I was frozen in place, eyes glued to the woods. The cluster of trees danced for a moment, then fell still, followed by an eerie silence. Even then I dismissed it as a trick of the light or perhaps a deer. I resumed my ride, attempting to shake off the unease, but the feeling of being followed intensified with every mile. By the time I hit the 5-mile mark, the atmosphere around me had shifted. The quiet felt heavy, almost oppressive. Just as I rounded a bend, I saw it again, a figure standing amongst the thick foliage, partially obscured but unmistakably present. It was towering, with a translucent skin that seemed to shimmer like fog, merging seamlessly with the environment. A low growl emanated from its form, resonating through the air and vibrating within my chest. I clenched the handlebars of my scooter, adrenaline propelling me forward, but I couldn't shake the image of the skull-like face popping through the shadows. I flipped a 180 and booked it. I pushed my scooter to its limits. The familiar hum of the engine drowned out my rapid breathing. Suddenly, though, the figure broke free from the tree line, moving from 2 legs to 4 in a blink of an eye. I gasped as it galloped closer, muscles rippling beneath its oily skin, a predator stalking its prey. I had a bit of a lead on it, but from what I saw it was closing in fast. Terrified, I leaned forward, desperate to escape, but the path ahead felt endless. With every turn, the growling sound it made grew more prominent over the hum of my squeaky ride. I was no longer just riding home, I was fleeing for my life. Every turn was nearly a wipeout, and every straightaway was taken advantage of. From here on out, I gave it full power, while throwing looks over my shoulder every few seconds. I don't know how, but I eventually lost sight of it, only feeling my determination to get the hell out of there. Well, those last few miles went on forever, as you might imagine, but I made it back in one piece, with only 10% of the battery life remaining. Though the memory of my encounter still frightens me to this day, I have such a profound appreciation for that little scooter. After all, it delivered me from what may have been a gruesome experience. My advice: always be aware of your surroundings and keep your senses sharp. Thank you, Rusty. Justin. Story 2. January 2024. It was a chilly March morning in Wyoming, and I was up before the sun to tackle the fence repair job on the north edge of my 40 acres of farmland. My loyal dog Blue trotted beside me as I began to secure the loose posts. The air was crispy and cold, and the occasional gust of wind rustled the snow-dusted grass. As I worked, I couldn't help but feel a sense of tranquility wash over me. This was my land, and I was its guardian. Suddenly, though, Blue's ears perked up, and he let out a low, slow growl. I turned to him, wondering what had caught his attention. That's when I saw it. A small, sleek aircraft hovering silently above us, its presence eerily calm. I squinted into the sun, trying to make out the model or any distinguishing features, but this drone was unlike anything I'd ever seen or read about on TV. There were no flashing lights, no obvious propellers, no discernible shape to speak of. It was as if it was hovering there simply because it wanted to. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I continued to study the machine. At some point, though, it sort of disappeared into the backdrop of the sky, becoming one with it. I shrugged it off mainly because I had to get the job done, but I was still watching the sky. But as we began to finish up the fence repair, the drone returned to the same exact spot. It simply hovered there, observing us with an unblinking gaze. I felt a sense of unease as if it were studying me, Blue, in our simple lives. I tried to shake off that feeling, but I couldn't help feel a creeping sense of dread. The drone's design defied all logic. It had no wings, no obvious engine, and no visible control surfaces. It was as if it had been conjured from some other dimension. Before I could process my thoughts, the drone vanished again into thin air. As I stood there frozen, Blue let out a curious little yelp, and I turned to him and we shared a moment of confusion. Where had it gone? And why had it been watching me in the first place? I looked around, wondering if anybody else had seen it, but the surrounding landscape was empty. The silence was oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just been a part of something much larger and much more sinister. This didn't happen just once, but 3 different times within a week of each other. I don't know what it was, and honestly, I'm not sure I even want to know at this point. I just hope Blue and I never have to see that creepy thing again, and maybe then we can get some real work done. Thanks, Rusty. Farmer Fred. Story 3. Hi, Rusty. My name is Jamie, and I'm a forestry major at the University of Maine. Last year, I had an experience that changed the way I view the natural world around me. I was just about to wrap up the fall semester and was working on some last-minute studies in a rural part of southern Maine not far from the Saco area. The day had began just like any other, my boots crunching against the fallen leaves of Maine's untamed woods as I prepared to gather data for my forestry assignment. I was tasked with identifying tree species in a secluded area known only to a few local hikers. The air was cool and crispy, the kind that fills the lungs with promise. As I ventured deeper, however, an unusual hush enveloped me. Birds ceased their song, and the rustling underbrush fell silent, as if the very forest had drawn a breath and held it. It felt enchanting, like I had stepped into a reverie of where time itself surrendered to the beauty that surrounded me. As I knelt to jot down some notes on my findings, I glanced up and was struck by a peculiar sight. The trees shimmered with an ethereal glow, and the green and browns of the forest transformed into vibrant hues of blue and violet, as if the sun had been replaced by something completely different altogether. In that moment, though, I felt an energy enveloped me, unlike anything I had ever experienced before. It pulled at the edges of my awareness, inviting me deeper into the wilderness. I knew at that point that I should feel uneasy, yet there was an allure to the transformation taking place before me, drawing me into what felt like a portal to another world, or at least that's how I describe this. A place woven from beauty, almost untouched by time. But as I wandered further, the charm waned into something more unsettling. The air thickened with an oppressive darkness, a presence lurking just beneath the surface of the beauty that had surrounded me. The vibrant colors began to bleed into ashen tones, the enchanting landscape morphing into shadows that seemed to twist at the edges of my vision. Despite the visual splendor, dread settled in my gut. I was no longer sure where time was or how long I had been there. I could almost hear whispers carried on the breeze, fragmented thoughts and muted cries that twisted my sense of reality. It became a struggle, not to just move through its strange realm, but to remain anchored to the knowledge of who I was and where I came from. As the atmosphere shifted once more, the portal began to close. The beauty faded, and the forest returned to its usual state. I stood frozen in that spot, heart racing, as the cacophony of birds chirping and the gentle rustling of leaves returned. I retrieved my notebook, fingers trembling as I documented the jarring contrasts, the juxtaposition of beauty and darkness, an otherworldly splendor that was undeniably beautiful yet unsettling. My observations felt like a warning, a testament to the fragile barrier between my world and the one I briefly inhabited. As I made my way back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I might not be the last one to step into that portal. Prior to this experience, I have never even considered such a thing could be possible, but it is. It happened to me. Thank you, Rusty, and I appreciate your stories. Kindly, Jamie. Story 4. Hello, Rusty. I work with the U.S. Forest Service. And one night, as I made my way home after a long day of patrolling the dense forests of eastern Colorado, well, I was met with a lot of snow, and it was coming down in blankets on the road. I turned on the radio to offer some comfort, but it just crackled with strange static. And the music I heard in between stations became distorted into haunting melodies that sent shivers down my back. Something new, something different. I'd never heard my radio do this before. I tried to adjust the knobs, hoping it was just a glitch in the signal. But then, without warning, the engine sputtered and died, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by endless trees and swirling snow. With only the fading light of dusk to guide me, I stepped out of my truck, the cold biting at my cheeks as I opened the hood to check on the engine. As I peered down into the dark engine compartment, my fingers fumbled at the dim light of my cell phone. The wind howled around me, growing louder as I worked to find the issue. Just as I discovered a loose battery connection, I heard it. Faint at first, distant wails that seemed almost human. I froze, listening intently as the sound shifted, morphing into deep, gut-wrenching howls mixed with the chilling laughter that echoed through the trees. I held my breath as I glanced toward the woods, the growing darkness pressing in from all sides. Whatever was making those sounds was not far away, and it was getting closer. Feeling a surge of panic, I quickly tightened the connection and jumped back into my truck, trying to shake off the feeling that eyes were watching me from all around. With bated breath, I turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, coughed, and finally roared to life after what seemed like an eternity. Relief washed over me, but before I could drive away, the headlights caught something lurking at the edge of the tree line. I froze again. The creature was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Tall and skeletal, with limbs unnaturally long, as its skin appeared in a ghastly shade of gray, stretched over tight, sharp bones. The face was a twisted mockery of humanity, wide mouth contorted into a toothy grin that seemed to split its head in half. Two bright, glowing eyes pierced the darkness, shining like the moon yet filled with a predatory hunger. I could see the almost flower-like pattern of decaying flesh that loomed along its arms, and I suddenly realized it was no longer laughing. It was silently watching me, waiting for the moment I'd be foolish enough again to step out of the truck. Those were the last images I had of the thing as I peeled away from that dark section of highway. I don't know what it was that I saw up there on that night, but I do know what it wasn't. Nothing like I'd ever seen before. The nightmares are a testament to that. I still have them from time to time, but they're getting better. I appreciate you sharing my story, Rusty. Thank you very much. Brandon. Story 5. Hi, Rusty. My name is Kelly, and at the time I had my experience, I was planning to attend a seminar for work the following day. It was something like early March of last year, and as I drove across Missouri on a cold winter night, I decided to stop at a random rest area along the famous Route 66. I arrived to an empty parking lot, turned off the ignition, grabbed my hygiene supplies, and stepped out of the car. The air that met me was chilly, and the snow crunched underneath my shoes as I hurried into the dimly lit restroom. I thought it would be a quick stop, so I hurriedly used the toilet and washed my hands. While preparing to brush my teeth, well, something strange happened. The tube of toothpaste flew off the sink and skid across the cold concrete floor. I stared at it, but convinced myself that maybe I had bumped it without noticing. I just shook my head and continued. But then things got even weirder. As I turned to wash my toothbrush, I heard the sound of toilets flushing. I froze, thinking that I was all alone in there, but someone was obviously in there with me. So I walked over to them, only to find them completely empty. I checked the toilets, and they were the old kind that only flush when you press a button on the back of it. And nobody was in there. A chill ran down my back, and I realized that I was all alone in this creepy restroom with weird things happening. Feeling a little jittery, I made my way back to the sink to grab my toothbrush. Just then, though, I glanced at the cracked mirror above the sink and saw a dark shape behind me, moving slowly and silently. Immediately I turned around quickly to see nothing there. My heart raced and I dashed out of the restroom before I could think twice. What had I just seen? I darted into my car and drove away as fast as I could. I eventually made it to the seminar on time, but I spent the remainder of my trip trying to process what it was I experienced at that old rest area on Route 66. I'd like to dig deep on the history of the area and see if there's anything that makes sense. We'll see. Thanks so much, Rusty. I enjoy your videos. Kindly, Kelly. Hello, folks, and Happy New Year to you. I sure hope you all had a fine holiday season, but it's time to get that ball rolling once again. So as those cold winter months begin to move on in, so do those odd, eerie, and unusual experiences sent in by our listeners. So lock your doors, draw the shades, grab a strong drink, and throw another log on that fire. Because tonight, it's storytelling time. Story 1. Baxter State Park in Maine, December 29th, 2018. Hello, Rusty. My name's Daniel Lowe, a winter hiker from Bangor, Maine. I spent years photographing Mount Katahdin, but in late 2018, I was camping near Chimney Pond at an elevation of 3,000 feet during a severe cold snap. At one point I measured minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit, freezing even the camera's battery. Now, Baxter in winter goes dead and quiet, except for the limbs cracking in the cold all around you. But that's what I wanted. I wanted isolation, but I ended up getting something else. At around 2 a.m., the snow outside my tent shifted. Not a stomp or a scurry, more like measured human steps, circling slowly. And when I called out, they seemed to stop, right behind the tent. I heard deliberate, steady breathing, but too slow for a person, and too low for the human voice. Almost like a mechanical imitation of lungs. And that's when the nylon of the tent pressed in from the other side, as if something were leaning against it. I freaked out. That's when I tore outside with my flashlight and my gun, and I noticed that only my footprints were the ones leading away from the camp. Otherwise, the snow was unbroken, but on the inside of my tent, trapped in frost, was a handprint smaller than mine. Fingers fanned out and abnormally long. The shape was clear even as ice crystals spread across its edges. Now fast forward a couple hours. Back at Roaring Brook Ranger Post, the night officer didn't laugh at all when I told him about my experience. He just nodded and said, quote, "We call her the Winter Widow." Files from the Search and Rescue Unit 14 showed 3 camp abandonments near Chimney Pond since 1996. Same conditions. Identical reports of small human prints in fresh snow. Well, the rumor is that a woman froze there in 1858, searching for her missing son, and that anyone who sleeps near the basin's frozen pond sometimes hears a second heartbeat in the wind. I didn't believe it until the sound followed me halfway down the trail on my way back. Steady, then slowly, like someone gradually matching my pace right beside me in the dark. Well, even now, I hear that breath when the heater in my house cycles on. Long, cold, and just outside the window. Thanks for sharing my story, Rusty. I really appreciate it. It was a weird experience, and it stays with me even till this day. Sincerely, Mr. Lowe. Story 2. Olympic National Park in Washington State, January 9th, 2017. Name's Cal Porter, wildlife biologist with the Olympic Field Division. In early 2017, I was part of a monitoring project studying elk migration patterns around the Hall Rainforest. We were cataloging thermal signatures on Mount Olympus's West Ridge when one night something impossible appeared on our infrared camera feed. It was around 2:40 a.m. when the motion alarm buzzed and the screen displayed a long, spindly figure crawling vertically down a spruce trunk. 8 limbs, not 4, but 8, each one jointed all wrong and weird. At first I thought it was a software glitch until one of its legs flexed, and the image rolled onto all fours, but hot enough to register bright white on the thermal imaging camera. We hurried out with spotlights. The moment the beams hit that tree line, the forest went dead still. No wind, no melting drips, just total silence. Then a dry cracking sound echoed overhead, followed by a faint scraping, like something moving upside down across the bark. My partner shined the beam upward and screamed, and all I saw was a blur retreating higher, elongated arms gripping bark in rhythm too smooth to be human. Then, a hush, and snowfall resumed. The next morning we found tracks the size of hands, palms flat with pointed finger imprints, 6 on each side, raking across snow before stopping mid-path. Rangers who reviewed the footage later called it a malfunction. The data drive from that night wiped blank the moment the files were opened. Local Keenot stories describe the spirit called Tosquick, roughly translating to the hanger in the boughs, a creature that hunts silently above snow travelers in the treetops. Well, of course, skeptics call it folklore, yet in 2003, another crew in the same region reported, quote-unquote, motion in the canopy that left identical claw-like print marks on their tents. Sometimes when I hike alone near Olympus now, I look up instinctively every few minutes or so without realizing it. Something like that changes you. You can't unsee it. You can't unexperience it. As far as I know, Rusty, tarantulas are one of the biggest spiders in the world. But whatever these were, I think it deserves a new classification. Some kind of spider cryptid creature, I don't know. But it was disturbing, nightmarish, hellish, and it changed the way I look at Mother Nature. I appreciate you sharing my story, Rusty. Happy New Year to you. Thank you, Cal Porter. Story 3. Rocky Mountain National Park, Colorado, December 14th, 2015. Hi, Rusty. I was a seasonal maintenance tech for Rocky Mountain National Park, assigned to inspect their fire risk at decommissioned backcountry shelters, such as Cabin 7, which sat 3 miles from Moraine Park. Remote, abandoned, and sealed up since 1989 after 2 winter deaths occurred there that are still unsolved to this day. Now I hacked in with snowshoes, finding the place half buried and silent under spruce forest. When I entered, my headlamp illuminated a kitchen still stocked. Very odd, I thought. But there it was, coffee tin, enamel cups frozen in place, but not decayed. The weirdest thing was the smell there. Wood smoke and warm cedar, though there was no fire, nor any evidence there had been one in the last 30 years. But when I touched the old cast iron stove, it was warm to the hand. The temperature inside read 62 degrees, but outside read -12. Then came footsteps above my head. Heavy, shuffling, pacing upstairs in a building whose access ladder had rotted away decades ago. Floorboards creaked in rhythm with the sound of a rocking chair, slowly and steadily moving, followed by something knocking on the wall behind the cabin. Not random, but deliberate. Well, that's when I got a little spooked and decided it was time to go. Something about this cabin wasn't right. At that point, I exited the cabin and fled, while radioing in my experience to the 2 rangers that were still on duty. Well, the next day, apparently they came back out to inspect the cabin. They noted that the interior was ice cold, the windows opaque with rime. The cups I described were gone. The table itself had collapsed from moisture rot over the years, and according to the archives, it never should have existed. It hasn't existed for over 30 years. Property files show Cabin 7 burned partially in 1979 during a lightning storm. Both victims that winter were found frozen upright by the doorway, arms outstretched like they had been knocking for help. My reports were quietly filed under, quote-unquote, environmental hallucination. Well, to this day, Rusty, I just can't make sense of it all. And that's really my strange experience, Rusty. Thank you for sharing. Story 4. Shenandoah National Park in Virginia, January 28, 2022. Hi Rusty and Happy New Year to ya. My name is Amber, and I was a part of the Shenandoah's Canine Search and Rescue program. I'd worked 7 winters with my dog Tango, a black German Shepherd trained for avalanche and missing person recovery. In January 22, we were assisting in a solo hiker search near Skyline Drive, around milepost 58. Now temperatures were hovering around 12 degrees Fahrenheit, snow crust glittering under full moonlight. It was beautiful, the part of the job I always looked forward to, the scenic part. Now Tango was the best dog I'd ever handled. Steady nose, fearless. We'd been tracking all afternoon, just past 7 p.m. when he stopped cold. Hair raised, ears rigid. He refused to move forward toward a grove of leafless oaks. Then without warning, he sprinted straight into it, into the darkness of ice-covered trees. I followed quickly with my headlamp cutting through sleet, calling his name until my voice cracked. When the beam finally caught something, it froze me. His collar, the bright orange one with the GPS tag, was dangling from a low branch, swinging slowly in the still air. No wind, yet it spun like a pendulum, perfectly balanced. Beneath it, no prints, no blood, no sign of a struggle. I radioed in. Search teams swept the grid for 3 days. Heat drones picked up a faint signature about 50 yards east on the first night. Something small moving in erratic circles. When investigators closed in and arrived, nothing remained but the same branch, stripped of its bark, where the collar had hung before. Well, they had cut it down for analysis, but not much became of it. Now, the behavioral specialist suggested a predator encounter, but no drag marks, no fluid, no tracks of any kind existed around the site. Tango's unit logs showed his GPS tag stopped transmitting at 1914, exactly 14 seconds after his last signal. The Forest Service later remarked that the area was quote-unquote restricted for wildlife study. Eventually, they gave me back his tag weeks later, and that's really all that became of my experience, Rusty. We haven't seen Tango since, but we keep hoping that someday he'll mysteriously reappear, even though we know the chances of that happening are 0 to none. Thank you, Tango, and thank you, Rusty. Story 5. January 7th, 2016. Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming. I'm Eli Tanner, former seasonal fishing guide in Yellowstone. My Uncle James and I had been ice fishing at Lewis Lake, deep in the park's southern zone, where hydrothermal vents sometimes keep the ice thin. Locals warn never to fish over bubbles where steam ripples meet the frost lines. Well, that morning it was around negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit when we drilled through to what we thought was safe ice. By noon, my uncle's line snagged something heavy, and when he pulled up, I heard a low bubbling sound, and then a voice followed it. Faint, distant, feminine. It was speaking through the ice, just barely audible under the wind. I felt the vibration more than I heard it, as if someone spoke inches from the hole beneath us. My uncle thought it was sound from shifting ice, until the next sound came. Another voice. Well, that's when we dropped everything and packed up to leave. But as I wound in my line, the tip trembled violently and drew a small, soaking crimson thread through the hole. Blood in the melt water, thin and steaming in the negative temperature. We were out of there in less than 10 minutes. Now, 2 weeks later, officials located a missing snowmobiler, Alice Frost, whose last known phone ping was at our exact fishing coordinates the previous winter. Her machine was found upright but empty, encased under ice less than a mile from our hole. A geothermal specialist later told me Lewis Lake has vent pockets where gases echo like speech, thus explaining what we may have heard. But he couldn't explain the fact that 911 dispatch traced a single call from Alice's phone 2 days later after the official disappearance date, registered by a brief static field transmission at 165.8 MHz, the park's emergency ranger frequency. Now every January, I still hear bursts of static on my CB radio that sounds like words, garbled, underwater, pleading. I no longer fish in that area. Thank you, Eli. Story 6. January 12th, 2020. Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee. Hello, Rusty, and Happy New Year to ya. My name's Laura Finch, Winter Ecology Guide, formerly stationed at Klingman's Dome. On January 12th, 2020, I led 2 physiology students on a climate survey along the Sugarland Mountain Trail. Temperatures that day hovered around 9 degrees Fahrenheit, visibility less than a mile. While 2 hours in, fresh snowfall revealed bare human footprints, small, narrow, deliberate, cutting across the trail. The prints continued in perfect single file, up a slope so steep even deer avoided it. We followed until the track simply stopped, vanishing mid-slope beneath heavy spruce, as if their maker had stepped into thin air. That's when we noticed silence. No bird calls, no wind, absolute dead calm. Then came the whispering, dozens of voices, faint but sharp as static, murmuring at ear level. It wasn't breeze. It was inside the silence, mixed in with it. My flashlight's beam flickered wildly, dancing across trunks where dark stains patterned the bark. At first, we thought it was sap, but the red-black flecks froze mid-drip. Fresh blood turned ice. Back at the ranger post, the supervisor pulled one report from the archive, referring to unexplained bare footprints ending mid-slope. Now the Cherokee oral history calls this section Nunehi Ridge, known as the passage where invisible forces guide travelers off the path when the world of the living and dead overlap. Now, it sounds like folklore, and I'm pretty sure it is, but even logical explanations couldn't comfort me that night. Park cameras installed the next week captured nothing but a single frame of snow disturbed in a perfect spiral. And that was really all there was to it. Just a strange, odd experience, and I thought I'd share it with you, Rusty. I appreciate it. Thank you, Laura.